Welcome to Hero Biography, where legends and extraordinary individuals are brought to life through inspiring stories that help you learn, grow, and level up every day. Subscribe now so you don't miss out. The Roman Empire was supposed to be dead. For generations, the world had watched the West collapse into chaos. The mighty legions that once conquered continents were gone. Rome itself, the city that had ruled the known world for centuries, had been abandoned to decay, war, and foreign kings. To most people, the empire of Caesar and Augustus existed only in broken statues, ruined roads, and fading memories. But in the 6th century, one man refused to accept that Rome's story was over. Far away in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian I became obsessed with an impossible dream: rebuilding the Roman Empire at a time when almost everyone believed it could never rise again. He wanted to reclaim the lost territories of the West. He wanted the Roman banner flying once more over Italy. And above all, he wanted Rome itself. There was only one problem. The Ostrogoths controlled the Italian peninsula with massive armies of hardened warriors. The empire was exhausted. Its treasury was strained. Its military resources were limited. Justinian did not have the overwhelming force needed to retake an entire nation. What he had was one general, a man feared by enemies, admired by soldiers, and trusted with missions no one else could survive. His name was Belisarius. Outnumbered, isolated, and marching into hostile territory with only a few thousand men, Belisarius was about to attempt something so reckless, so ambitious, that failure seemed inevitable. And yet, against all odds, he would come closer than anyone imagined to bringing Rome back from the dead. Belisarius did not come from one of the great ancient families of Rome. He was not born into enormous wealth, political influence, or royal privilege. In many ways, that was what made his rise so extraordinary. At a time when the Byzantine Empire was filled with ambitious aristocrats competing for power, Belisarius earned his reputation the hard way, on the battlefield. From an early age, he proved himself different from other commanders. He was disciplined, calm under pressure, and almost unervingly patient during combat. While many generals of the era relied on brute force and overwhelming numbers, Belisarius understood something far more valuable. Wars were often decided long before the main battle even began. He studied terrain. He manipulated enemy expectations. He moved quickly, struck unexpectedly, and avoided wasting the lives of his soldiers whenever possible. To the men under his command, he was more than a general. He was a leader willing to fight beside them in the chaos of war. That loyalty mattered, because by the time Emperor Justinian began dreaming of reclaiming the lost Western Roman Empire, the Byzantine military was already stretched thin. The empire faced threats on multiple frontiers, constant political tension, and growing financial pressure. Launching a massive invasion of Italy would have been risky even with unlimited resources. But Justinian did not have unlimited resources. What he had was Belisarius. Years earlier, Belisarius had already shocked the empire with a series of stunning victories against overwhelming enemies. He crushed rebellions, defeated powerful Persian forces in the east, and helped restore stability during moments when the empire itself seemed close to collapse. Again and again, he succeeded in situations where failure looked certain. That reputation made him the only realistic choice for Justinian's most dangerous mission: retake Italy, restore Rome, rebuild the glory of the empire. It sounded less like a military campaign and more like fantasy. Italy was controlled by the Ostrogoths, a powerful Germanic kingdom that had ruled the region for decades. Their warriors were experienced, heavily armed, and familiar with the terrain. More importantly, they vastly outnumbered the force Belisarius was given. When the campaign began in 535 AD, Belisarius crossed into Italy with only a relatively small army, just a few thousand soldiers tasked with reclaiming lands that had once belonged to the greatest empire on earth. To many observers, the mission looked suicidal. Even some Roman citizens doubted the campaign could succeed. The Western Empire had already fallen generations earlier. Entire cities had adapted to Gothic rule. Many believed the age of Rome was over forever, and no amount of ambition could change that reality. But Belisarius marched forward anyway. His army moved across the Mediterranean and into Sicily, where his reputation alone began opening doors. Cities surrendered without major resistance. Local populations, exhausted by years of instability and war, saw in Belisarius something they had not seen in a long time: the return of Roman authority. Still, everyone understood the deeper challenge ahead. Taking territory was one thing. Holding Italy against the full power of the Gothic kingdom would be something entirely different. As Belisarius pushed closer toward mainland Italy, every mile increased the danger. Supply lines stretched thinner. Reinforcements remained limited. One major defeat could destroy the entire expedition and end Justinian's dream forever. Yet despite the risks, Belisarius continued advancing toward the heart of Italy with remarkable confidence. Because unlike many commanders, he did not measure victory by the size of his army. He measured it by discipline, speed, strategy, and the ability to make his enemies fear uncertainty itself. And soon, all of Italy would begin to learn exactly why that made him so dangerous. The campaign that was supposed to fail began succeeding almost immediately. After securing Sicily with remarkable speed, Belisarius pushed north toward mainland Italy, and with every victory, the balance of power began to shift. Cities that once believed Gothic rule was permanent suddenly found themselves questioning everything. The return of a Roman army, even a small one, carried enormous psychological weight. For decades, the idea of Rome reclaiming the West had seemed impossible. Now, suddenly it no longer did. Belisarius understood that his greatest weapon was not manpower. It was momentum. He could not afford long wars of attrition or massive battlefield losses. His army was too small for that. Every soldier mattered. Every delay was dangerous. So instead of relying on slow traditional warfare, Belisarius moved with relentless speed. He attacked before his enemies fully understood his position. He forced cities into difficult decisions before Gothic reinforcements could arrive. He used deception, surprise, and carefully timed assaults to create the illusion that his forces were larger than they actually were. Again and again it worked. Some cities surrendered without resistance. Others opened negotiations almost immediately after hearing Belisarius was approaching. Local populations, exhausted from years of instability, heavy taxation, and conflict, often preferred surrender over destruction. In many places, the Byzantine army was viewed not as foreign conquerors, but as the return of legitimate Roman authority. That perception changed everything. Belisarius encouraged it deliberately. Unlike invading armies that relied entirely on terror, he understood the value of discipline and image. He knew that fear could open gates, but trust could keep them open. As his forces advanced deeper into Italy, Gothic leaders struggled to respond effectively. Their armies were powerful, but they were not prepared for a commander who moved so unpredictably. Belisarius avoided fighting on terms that favored the Goths. He chose mobility over brute force, precision over recklessness. When opportunities appeared, he struck immediately. When risks became too high, he disappeared before the enemy could trap him. His campaigns felt less like traditional warfare and more like controlled chaos. And slowly, city by city, the Gothic kingdom began losing control. Then came the ultimate prize. Even after decades of decline, Rome still carried unmatched symbolic power. It was more than a city. It was the heart of an empire that had shaped Western civilization itself. Whoever controlled Rome controlled the narrative of legitimacy, power, and history. The Goths understood that. So did Belisarius. In 536 AD, as Belisarius approached the Eternal City, tensions spread across Italy. Many expected a catastrophic battle for control of Rome. Others feared the city would be destroyed in another brutal siege. But something unexpected happened. The Gothic garrison abandoned the city. As Belisarius marched toward Rome, the gates were opened to him. For the first time in generations, Roman troops entered Rome not as invaders, but as restorers. The moment carried enormous emotional weight. Ancient monuments still towered above the streets. Crumbling forums and abandoned imperial buildings stood as reminders of Rome's former greatness. Though diminished, the city still represented the soul of the empire. and now Belisarius held it. The impossible dream of Justinian suddenly felt real. Across the Mediterranean, news spread rapidly. The Roman Empire had returned to Rome itself. What once seemed like fantasy was becoming history. But beneath the celebration, Belisarius understood the truth better than anyone else. Taking Rome had been the easy part. Keeping it would demand everything he had. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, the Gothic armies were already gathering for war. The celebration inside Rome did not last long. Belisarius had retaken the Eternal City, but everyone understood the reality of the situation. The Goths would never allow Rome to remain in Byzantine hands without a fight. Losing the ancient capital was more than a military setback. It was a humiliation that threatened the legitimacy of Gothic rule across Italy. And the Gothic king, Vitiges, intended to take it back at any cost. Across northern Italy, warriors began gathering from every direction. Thousands of Gothic soldiers marched south toward Rome. Hardened veterans, cavalry units, archers, and heavy infantry converged into one enormous force determined to crush Belisarius before the Byzantines could fully secure their position. The scale of the coming conflict terrified the population. Rome itself was no longer the invincible metropolis it had once been centuries earlier. The population had shrunk dramatically. Many ancient buildings stood abandoned or partially ruined. The empire that once controlled the Mediterranean now struggled to defend even a single city in Italy. And inside those walls stood Belisarius with only a fraction of the troops needed for a conventional defense. Some estimates suggest the Gothic army may have outnumbered the Byzantines several times over. To many observers, the outcome seemed obvious. Rome was isolated, vulnerable, and surrounded by enemies with superior numbers. But Belisarius refused to panic. Instead of abandoning the city or seeking open battle, he immediately focused on preparing Rome for siege warfare. He inspected the ancient walls personally, identifying weak points and reinforcing defenses wherever possible. Gates were secured. Supplies were gathered. Defensive positions were organized with ruthless efficiency. He understood something critical from the beginning. If the Goths wanted Rome, they would have to bleed for it. In early 537 AD, the Gothic army finally arrived outside the city. The sight must have been overwhelming. Campfires stretched across the countryside surrounding Rome. Tens of thousands of enemy soldiers encircled the ancient capital. Roads were blocked. Communication became dangerous. The city was effectively trapped. The siege had begun. Almost immediately, the pressure intensified. The Goths cut aqueducts supplying water to the city, hoping to weaken morale and create chaos inside Rome. Food became increasingly scarce. Trade stopped almost entirely. Civilians feared starvation as the weeks dragged on. Inside the city, tension spread rapidly. Many people doubted Belisarius could survive what was coming. Some feared betrayal. Others whispered that surrender might be the only realistic option before Rome was destroyed yet again. But Belisarius projected absolute calm. That calm mattered, because leadership during a siege was not just about military tactics, it was psychological warfare. If panic spread inside the walls, Rome would collapse long before the Goths ever breached the defenses. So Belisarius stayed visible. He rode along the walls. He spoke directly to soldiers. He supervised repairs and defensive preparations himself. He made it clear that surrender was not being considered. At the same time, the Goths began launching attacks against the city's defenses. Their forces tested gates, probed weak sections of wall, and searched for opportunities to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. But the Romans fought back fiercely. Archers rained arrows down from fortified positions. Defensive artillery hurled projectiles into attacking formations. Every assault became costly for the Goths. Still, the reality remained brutal. Belisarius was trapped inside Rome with limited manpower, uncertain reinforcements, and an enemy army large enough to eventually wear the city down through exhaustion alone. And the Gothic king believed time was on his side. What he did not yet understand was that Belisarius had no intention of fighting a passive defensive war. Because while the Goths believed they were besieging Rome, Belisarius was already preparing to turn the siege against them. Belisarius understood something the Gothic commanders did not. A siege was not simply a test of walls. It was a test of endurance, discipline, morale, and time. And if he allowed the Goths to control the pace of the war, Rome would eventually fall. So instead of waiting passively behind the city's defenses, Belisarius transformed the entire battlefield into a weapon. The ancient walls of Rome became the foundation of his strategy. Though old and partially damaged, they were still massive enough to slow any direct assault. Belisarius positioned archers along key defensive points and rotated troops constantly to prevent exhaustion. Every gate was reinforced. Every tower became a platform for missile fire. But static defense alone would never be enough. Belisarius knew the Goths expected fear, hesitation, and desperation from the trapped defenders inside Rome. What they encountered instead was aggression. Relentless aggression. Almost every time the Gothic army attempted to organize siege operations, Roman forces struck unexpectedly. Small cavalry detachments rode out of the city at high speed, targeting isolated patrols, supply wagons, and vulnerable camps before disappearing back behind the walls. The attacks rarely destroyed massive portions of the Gothic army. That was not the point. The goal was exhaustion, confusion, psychological pressure. Belisarius wanted the Goths to feel unsafe everywhere. At night, the situation became even worse for the besieging army. Roman troops launched sudden raids under darkness, attacking sentries, burning equipment, and disrupting attempts to build siege structures. Gothic soldiers who expected an easy victory instead found themselves trapped in a grinding war of uncertainty. Sleep became difficult. Morale began to crack. Every day the siege continued, the Gothic army consumed enormous amounts of food and resources. Thousands of soldiers crowded around Rome required constant supply lines stretching across hostile territory. Disease spread through the camps. Weather conditions worsened. Frustration grew with every failed assault. Meanwhile, Belisarius remained patient. He refused to gamble everything on one decisive battle. Unlike reckless commanders obsessed with glory, Belisarius understood that survival itself could become victory. Every additional week Rome held out weakened the Goths more than it weakened him. That patience frustrated the enemy leadership. The Gothic king Vitiges had expected Rome to collapse quickly under pressure. Instead, months passed with little progress. Direct assaults against the walls repeatedly failed. Roman archers inflicted heavy casualties from elevated positions while defenders used the narrow approaches around gates and fortifications to neutralize the Goths' numerical advantage. In several engagements, Belisarius used cavalry with devastating efficiency. His mounted troops attacked exposed enemy formations with speed and precision before retreating safely behind defensive lines. These operations forced the Goths into a constant state of alertness, draining both energy and confidence. And slowly, the balance of the siege began shifting. The besiegers were becoming exhausted. The defenders were becoming stronger psychologically. Inside Rome, Belisarius maintained discipline with remarkable control. He kept soldiers focused, organized supplies carefully, and prevented panic from spreading among civilians. Even during moments of extreme pressure, he projected calm confidence. That confidence became contagious. The Goths had surrounded Rome expecting to crush a weakened enemy trapped inside ancient walls. Instead, they found themselves fighting a commander who seemed completely comfortable under impossible conditions. A commander who weaponized patience. A commander who understood that fear could destroy armies faster than swords ever could. As the months dragged on, the Gothic army began suffering from declining morale, supply shortages, and mounting casualties. What started as a campaign of conquest was slowly turning into a nightmare of attrition. And for the first time since the siege began, the unthinkable became possible. The Goths themselves were beginning to doubt whether Rome could actually be taken at all. By the spring of 538 AD, the Gothic siege of Rome was beginning to collapse under its own weight. What had started as a confident campaign to crush Belisarius and reclaim the Eternal City had turned into a brutal war of exhaustion. Month after month, the Goths had thrown men, resources, and energy against Rome's defenses, Yet the city still stood. And now the cracks inside the Gothic army were impossible to ignore. Food shortages worsened across their camps. Supply lines became increasingly vulnerable to Roman raids. Disease spread among exhausted soldiers forced to endure terrible living conditions outside the walls. Morale declined with every failed assault and every rumor that reinforcements for Belisarius might eventually arrive. The psychological balance of the war had completely shifted. At the beginning of the siege, the Goths believed time favored them. Now, time itself had become their enemy. Inside Rome, Belisarius sensed the change immediately. He understood that armies rarely collapsed all at once. They broke slowly, through frustration, fear, uncertainty, and fatigue. And after more than a year of constant pressure, the Gothic army was reaching its limit. Still, the danger remained enormous. One successful breach of the walls could erase everything Belisarius had accomplished. One major mistake could turn victory into catastrophe. So even as the Goths weakened, he refused to become careless. That discipline defined him. Belisarius never allowed emotion to replace strategy. While the enemy grew desperate, he remained controlled. While others chased glory, he focused only on survival and pressure. He understood that the siege was no longer about dramatic battlefield heroics. It was about endurance. And Rome had endured longer than anyone believed possible. Then finally, after months of failure, the Goths made their decision. They abandoned the siege. The enormous army that had surrounded Rome began withdrawing from the city it could not conquer. Camps were dismantled. Siege operations ceased. The roads around Rome slowly cleared as the exhausted Gothic forces retreated northward, carrying with them the reality of defeat. Against overwhelming odds, Belisarius had held the Eternal City. The impact of that victory echoed across the Mediterranean world. For the first time in generations, Rome had survived a major siege under Roman control. The impossible dream of restoring imperial authority in the West no longer looked ridiculous. Justinian's empire suddenly appeared powerful, resilient, and alive again. And at the center of that transformation stood Belisarius. His reputation exploded after the siege. Stories of the defense spread rapidly through the empire. Soldiers admired him. Citizens celebrated him. Even enemies began recognizing him as one of the most dangerous commanders of the age. Because what Belisarius achieved in Rome was more than a military victory. It was proof that leadership could overcome impossible circumstances. With fewer men, fewer resources, and little room for error, he had defeated a vastly larger force through discipline, patience, mobility, and psychological warfare. He had transformed weakness into strength and isolation into opportunity. Most importantly, he had restored something the Roman world had nearly lost forever. Belief. Belief that Rome could still fight. Belief that the empire could still survive. Belief that collapse was not always permanent. For the people inside the city, the victory felt almost miraculous. Rome had once again become a symbol of endurance rather than decline. The ancient capital, abandoned by history so many times before, had survived because one commander refused to surrender when surrender seemed inevitable. And from that moment forward, the name Belisarius became legend. Not because he commanded the largest armies. Not because he ruled an empire. But because when the world believed Rome was finished, he proved them wrong. Victory did not bring Belisarius peace. Despite saving the empire again and again, he would eventually become a victim of the same political system he fought so hard to protect. Jealous rivals feared his popularity. Powerful figures in Constantinople questioned his loyalty. At different moments in his life, the man who defended Rome against impossible odds found himself stripped of command, isolated from power, and surrounded by suspicion instead of gratitude. It is one of history's cruelest patterns. Empires often celebrate their heroes during war and fear them once the war is won. And yet, centuries later, the politics that once threatened Belisarius have been forgotten. The people who worked against him are mostly remembered only in footnotes of history. But Belisarius himself endured, because his story represents something far greater than ancient warfare. He became a symbol of resilience under pressure. A leader who stayed calm while the world around him collapsed. A commander who proved that discipline, adaptability, and vision could overcome overwhelming disadvantages. In many ways, that is why his story still resonates today, not only with historians, but with entrepreneurs, creators, leaders, and anyone fighting battles that seem impossible from the outside. Belisarius reminds us that greatness is not measured by perfect circumstances. It is measured by what someone does when the odds are completely against them. And for one extraordinary moment in history, when Rome stood on the edge of extinction, one man refused to let it die. If you enjoyed this story of Belisarius and the fall and rebirth of Rome, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications for more epic stories about forgotten empires, legendary generals, and the moments that changed human history forever.